Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with such a small group. Actually, I think I am like Kevin. I don't entirely enjoy standing behind podiums. It feels much more comfortable and free. Are we recording this? So will it pick me up if I stand here? No? Okay, I'll try to stand back here then. So I am from Alaska. I've been there for 26 years. I have a number of roles I fill within our department. More recently, I've been working in the Chukchi Sea, and part of that research has led me to begin to put together some ideas and see some patterns and concepts that are emerging from the work we're doing. So I want to talk about that today. And I have the pleasure of giving 3 presentations this week, and they're all tied in some way to this core presentation on change. So first thing I want to point out or mention is that Alaska's Arctic is a striking place. It's beautiful. It's a resource. Its beauty is a resource of itself. And it's also a dangerous, life-threatening place. And yet people have persisted there for millennia. And resources can be abundant but scarce. But people enjoy living there. And this picture shows some of the winter environment up north, and it's can be pretty harsh, 70 below, 80 below, very little daylight, and yet people persist. Alaska's Arctic is resource rich. So we have caribou in here, and this represents the resource richness of the area in that these animals come and go, right? So the resources occur in patches, seasonally and spatially. So if you're really dependent on some food source in the Arctic, it's probably not going to be there. You'll probably be there a day late or a day early. And so people have a hard time. They have to plan ahead. They have to think about all that's happening. And as we think about change, the patterns and the distributions of the resources also change. Alaska's Arctic marine systems are also resource rich. These are the 2 top predators, the walrus and the polar bear, and they're dependent upon other resources below them. The walrus are benthic feeding pinnipeds, and they feed on the stuff that I look at. I'm actually a benthic ecologist, so I deal with the animals that live in the sediments, and these guys are sediment feeders, and these polar bears, of course, that's what they're feeding on, the seals and stuff, whatever they can find. Right, so as we think about climate change, and we think about change in the Arctic, one of the things we're looking at is the ice habitat behind these animals. So Alaska's Arctic encompasses 3 seas. We have the Bering Sea, actually this part here, the northeastern Bering Sea. We have the Chukchi Sea, and then we have the Beaufort Sea. So the definition of the Arctic, of course, is bound by the Arctic Circle, but for the U.S. Governance and their definition, they allow this to extend down here because this component of the northeastern Bering and the southeastern Chukchi Sea is highly influential on what happens in the rest of the Arctic. So why are we even talking, why are we even being concerned about the Arctic, right? So the people live up there. There's resources that are extracted from there, and the resource extraction is one of the big deals, right? So what we have here shaded are the U.S. Lease sale areas for oil exploration. And so as you can see, these red blocks here, those are the sites that are leased for production. And so those little crosses are some proposed wells. And the conflict, of course, is that all of those resource extractions all occur in areas that are of high resource use by the very animals that the coastal communities here, Point Lay, Wainwright, Barrow, some of these other communities, all of these people here depend on the resources that are going to be affected by the resource extraction. They depend on the whales. They depend on the walrus. They depend on the seals. So we have a lot of conflict building in Alaska. We have a lot of potential points of risk. So there's a lot of effort in being put into understanding what's happening up here. Arctic ecosystems are in flux. So if we look at this as a picture of the ice extent in 1979 versus 2011, here is Alaska. Here is the area of the Alaska Arctic that we're concerned about, where people use the resources right in there. And you can see that the ice has gone back quite a bit. 2007 actually was one of the years with maximum extent. 2011 was also a year with high ice loss. That's a major change. So, and it happened quickly. If you look at and I'll show a plot later on, there was a kind of a gradual change, and all of a sudden it's as if we reached a tipping point, and all of a sudden the ice just started disappearing. Well, that's exactly what happened. The multi-year ice, the ice that builds up over many years, started to go away, and it reached a point where the annual ice that builds up couldn't keep up. And so now, once we lost the multi-year ice out about here, then now the annual ice just melts back really fast, the annual accumulation of ice. The multi-year ice is really thick. It's accumulation over many years. And every year, the ice freezes down into the Bering Sea. So seawater freezes down the Bering Sea, so that's called the annual ice, and that can melt back very quickly compared to the multi-year ice. So that's part of what's happening. So we have reductions in sea ice overall. We have reductions in seasonal ice cover. We have earlier ice meltback dates. And those are significant because I'll talk about that in just in a few more minutes. But one of the things is that these Arctic ecosystems are in flux, and we have high costs. We have high costs to human systems. So this is a village, Shishmaref, is being essentially washed away, and is being hit by more storms. Storms are more frequent. Storms are a little bit stronger, maybe. Well, there's no more ice to protect these areas, so the storms hit more frequently. The ice cover actually prevented a lot of these kind of storms from reaching the shoreline. So this is just an example. There are also a number of other costs. Communities are losing their connections, their social connections. Many of these communities, the social connections are built around whales. And so if they can't get whales because it's too dangerous to go out now, things like that happening, you know what, they begin to lose their identity. And the Alaska Native communities are losing their identities related to salmon. King salmon in particular are at risk of, actually, their population is really low right now. And so they're losing their identities because of the loss of whaling opportunities. So there's a lot of flux at the human level, the social ecosystem level. Arctic ecosystems are also in the flux there is also expensive for the animals. So these are walrus. Walrus are ice-associated animals. And for the most of the time, they like to be out on the ice. If the ice goes away, they have to come in near shore like they've done here. And so they can do that. The only problem is that when they're used to being in aggregations of 20 walrus here or 30 over here, maybe 100 over here, suddenly you put 5,000 walrus someplace, the young get trampled. And so we have increased mortality. We have increased stress. And if they can't get out, it costs more energy to get out to their feeding areas, to their foraging sites. They have higher energy expenses and they're able to accumulate less resources to survive the winter. So what defines an Arctic marine ecosystem? They're sea ice systems, high seasonality, and they have connections to lower latitudes, and that's actually the part I wanted to key in on today. Being an ice system, the animals are associated, the ice-associated animals are also dependent upon that ecosystem, and as that ice changes, much of the ecosystem itself changes. So Arctic, and the question, of course, is why should we care about what happens in the Arctic? Well, their high productivity supports commercial and subsistence harvests. In Alaska, in the Bering Sea, we have tremendous commercial fisheries for crabs and fish. In the Barents Sea, they have also fisheries in the Arctic seas. Our actual commercial fishing efforts in the Arctic proper are nil. There's nothing happening commercially, essentially because the resources aren't there. Our Arctic environment is a shallow shelf, and the production shifts to another component. Arctic ecosystems are also sites of human activities, oil extraction, oil and gas, mineral extraction, their transportation pathways, and the Arctic water is exported to ocean basins elsewhere. So if we have warming in the Arctic, ultimately, it may take a while, but we may have warming in the rest of the ocean, especially in the deeper waters. So what happens in the Arctic could be a bellwether of coming change for the rest of the world. So we have some of our concerns include resiliencies to rapid change, novel ecosystem interactions, and variations in connectivity, feedback with cycles of lower latitudes. Those are unknown, so we don't know what's happening there. What I have here for these pictures are a couple pictures of walrus feeding. So they're actually foraging in the sediments. Here's one actually sticking his head down. As I understand it, no, they don't use their tusks to dig. They use the whiskers to root around and fill. And so their tusks are actually for fighting and other things, but they don't dig with those as directly, as I understand it. They're able to actually, if they see one of their favorite foods is clams, big clams. If they see a clam hole, they're actually able to put their mouth over that and suck the clam out of the sediments. So they're a crazy animal. So one of our concerns is population level effects on migratory birds and mammal predators, such as the walrus. And those can have changes in predators and whatnot can have cascading effects. So we could have effects that expand out and that cascade to other environments and other levels. So then the first connectivities I've seen is climate. So this is a model from a website on the Arctic oscillation. It has to do with sea level pressure, air pressure in the Arctic. So we have a colder stratosphere. We have high pressure here. It forces some of the colds and storms down here. When we have less cold stratosphere, weaker pressure, some of the storms track differently. So it changes, the pressure up in the Arctic changes the climate and the weather patterns elsewhere. And when this is negative, when we have colder stratosphere, they actually have severe storms down in Europe. So it's pretty interesting. How would that influence ecosystems? Well, it changes water circulation. And it shifts, especially in the Arctic Ocean here, it shifts circulation patterns in large regions. Circulation can go clockwise in one condition and can go counterclockwise in another. And it changes the flow throughout the area. So for what I'm looking at, benthic animals I'm looking at, what I'm interested in is the flow northward, how the flow of water northward is influenced by the pressure. If you increase the pressure, you would expect to decrease water flow northward. The other connectivity I've been looking at is oceanographic connectivity. So all of the Arctic oceans, and this is the example from the Chukchi Sea, but it's as well elsewhere, were connected with lower latitudes via water circulation. So the greater sea level height in the North Pacific pushes water into the Arctic. And so as I understand it, one of the sources for the greater sea level height in the North Pacific is the melting of glaciers, right? So as our climate warms, glaciers melt faster, eventually those things are going to be gone. And in spite of what we hear about global warming and glaciers in Alaska, there are still very significant glaciers. And when it gets to be a warm day, the rivers rise by 20 feet. And so there is a significant amount of water being exported from the Alaska terrestrial environment into the ocean, and that translates into transport of waters northward. So we have a current here. This current is called the Alaska Coastal Current. That entrains fresher water with terrestrial carbon signatures. And then as we enter into this area, we have these other sources that come from here, and we call these Bering Sea waters and Anadyr water from the Gulf of Anadyr over here. Those tend to be more nutrient enriched, at least when they enter the Bering Sea and when they enter this area. By the time they get up here, all of the water is pretty much depleted of nutrients because of primary production, but this water current, this northward flow also entrains particulate matter that can then be used for food for the animals up north. So this is one of the study sites I've been working at in the Arctic. You can see this large area. This is part of what's called the Chukchi Sea Environmental Studies Program. And we've been there since 2008, 2008 to 2014. And this is one of the studies we did. It seems like every year the research sponsors wanted to change things up a little bit on us. And so that we sampled this large area in 2011 and 2012, where we can see some of the currents coming through here. This current actually wraps around here, comes back, and then converges with this current here, and then they all flow off this pattern. So we are in an interglacial period, right? And so when the glaciers build back up, sea level goes back down. This shelf in here is exposed. It's called the Bering Land Bridge. So this is a shallow shelf, and the way I like to think about this is that this are hills, and there is a watershed right here draining off into this what's called Barrow Canyon. So I've considered that a submerged watershed draining towards Barrow Canyon. When I begin to think about this way, some of the oceanographic patterns there begin to make sense. We're dealing with a submerged shelf. So this slide, I actually gave this presentation to something called the Joint Ocean Commission, and the spatial drivers of change is just to highlight how some of the differences in oceanographic patterns influence our communities. I'm actually going to talk about that tomorrow, so I'm going to save that conversation for a little bit. Just wanted to note that we're able to identify spatial drivers of change that are related to this connectivity. What I wanted to focus more today on was temporal drivers of change and climate. So these are some water temperature plots and some oceanographic characteristics, and this is a plot of the copepod calanus, of their densities. And so the point we want to make is that in warm years, we have low densities of calanus, and in cold years, we have high densities. These particular copepods are pelagic animals. They're associated with water masses. So the Calanus marshalli and glacialis, Calanus glacialis being a clue, it's an Arctic species, they're associated with cold water, right? And so it's not that just the water warms, it's that these different, the water mass, the locations of the water mass shift relative to climate, and when those water masses shift, we have changes in the pelagic communities. So for my work, I look at benthic animals. We also found a link with the Arctic Oscillation, which is this one. And we found a pretty high correlation with density and with the number of taxa, such that over this 5-year period in particular, the correlation was like 0.79. Of course, you get another year of data and all kinds of falls apart. The AO went this way and those went that way. But elsewhere in the North Pacific, San Francisco Bay and Port Valdez, we've identified a similar pattern, and the correlation should actually be an R squared, so of about 0.25. So the correlation should be about 0.5, right? So a change like that in 1 year is not, that's not as significant as the fact that in 3 systems we're seeing this general pattern. So it's so I expect that pattern will come back together. It would make sense that these measures would not come back down when this did, because our communities have built up very strongly in here. So, we'll see what happens in the coming years. I'll talk again about this, the temporal drivers of change in climate in my presentation here shortly. So, climate and temporal change at higher levels. This is a study of trying to aggregate historical bird information. Here's the number of ice-free days. So that number has been increasing. Here's bird abundance. You can actually see that for 2 components, near shore, which is here, and in the southern component, which is down here, that the numbers of birds have changed. And it's largely, if you look at these two, you can see that the composition has changed, not so much in this one, so we're seeing a decline in bird numbers in the southern section, but in the near shore, we've lost some of these piscivores, which are fish eaters, and we've gained more of these shearwaters. So we're seeing shifts in some of these birds. Some of these animals are following the food resources. Remember that slide I showed where we see that changing pattern with the copepods. Some of these decreases are associated with animals that are looking for food that's not there, so they actually go up into here. Linkages. 30% of the fauna we found in the Chukchi Sea are actually found in Prince William Sound, down here. And in fact, many of the invertebrate fauna are widely distributed from as far south as California up into the Chukchi Sea. And many seabirds and marine mammals travel even greater distances to feed in the Arctic. The point being that we are highly connected with lower latitudes. So these connectivities are both challenges too and sources for resiliency. Connectivities are a major source of change via heat transport. That's a big one. Connectivities also provide long-term sources for key fauna, nutrients, carbon, etc. So they advact in all of the ecosystem components. Connectivities are poorly known. And over geological scales, they change significantly. So in the U.S. Arctic, we stop and think about having rapid change now. Even greater changes have occurred in the past, especially when the shelf becomes exposed. So resiliencies of Arctic fauna are poorly studied. Alaska infauna have been studied with respect to a variety of human effects. Some components are actually highly resilient, but we haven't looked at that overall. When I think about those connectivities, and I think about the rapidly changing environment, I personally think that what happens through and because of the changes in the connections with lower latitudes may be more significant than we're identifying. People are just beginning to identify, oceanographers are beginning to identify the importance of heat flow northward. We're not really yet looking at the biogeography of fauna from south to north to identify that, but when I pull up animals from southeast Alaska and I look at animals from the Chukchi Sea, there are a lot of the same animals. So, you know, these whole systems are connected in ways that we just are only beginning to understand. And if we want to understand and make predictions about what's going to happen in the future in the Arctic, actually even in lower latitudes, these are some areas that I think we really need to be looking at. So we don't know, we don't have adequate information on biodiversity and what drives those things. So these are species accumulation curves. They're supposed to level out, you know, under the idea that you can replace temporal sampling with spatial sampling. That means if I get enough samples over space, then I really don't need to look over time because I'll have captured enough of the animals. Well, I have two sites, one in Glacial Fjord, one in the Chukchi Sea, and we can see that after 5 years, we're still gaining a lot of biodiversity information. 75% of species were captured in a homogeneous environment after 7 years. Short-term studies, which is mostly what people do, represent less than 50% of the species available. So that's a big deal. You know, if we're thinking about trying to collect this kind of information about what's happening and we only have 50% of our species identified, and I should add that these are at repeatedly sampled sites. If we switch our sites, that number goes down. We have inadequate information on ecosystem resiliencies, long-term variations. Just wanted to point out this is a spatial and temporal model of benthic community characteristics, and we need to design studies that can capture this kind of information where you can see patterns of change. And I'll be talking about those plot and this in the next plot here in particular in the next presentation I give. This is a spatial temporal model of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and a couple of sensitive species. We can see hydrocarbons are high here, sensitive species are low, these are high where the hydrocarbons are low, right? We do not know how these situations play out in the Arctic, and we know that cold water influences environmental tolerances of some of these animals to chemical pollution. So there's just so much we don't know. So my thoughts, statistically designed long-term monitoring efforts are needed. We need new directions and new thoughts. Spatial and temporal interactions between geomorphology, oceanography, climate, and biota may be some rich sources for understanding change. And I think that because of the connections with lower latitudes, that we really need to be thinking about this at macro scale patterns, not local patterns. So what happens over the course of interactions between two oceans, Arctic Ocean and the North Pacific Ocean, is maybe as important as what happens locally within the Chukchi Sea. Resiliencies and conservation of their sources, and I use the word plural resiliencies because I keep thinking of resiliencies, multiple types of resiliencies at multiple ecosystem components. Those may be important to consider when we think about conservation, especially when we think about climate change as climate variations, over global patterns. Excuse me. You know, I used to think about climate change, and I choose to use the word climate variations rather than climate change because whether it's warming or cooling, climate's always changing, right? And I was kind of thinking, well, I'm not so sure about this. You know, I hear the arguments back and forth. I'm not sure about the sources, and I still am not convinced about the sources. But if you want to see examples of climate change, global warming, come to the Arctic. There's nothing more striking than the what's happening up there. And connections among the seas, climate, and biota play a major role in ecological characteristics of these Arctic marine ecosystems, and also they play major roles in their changes. And effects extend backwards as well, and I think that's why the conversation is relevant to people everywhere. So that's it. Take some questions.
Any questions?
It's
Yes.
not much of a question, but there are remarks or observations from my part. First of all, your presentation is very, very interesting. And when I look at the picture of the ice cap, 1979, 2011, we don't need any prophets to tell us that the impact of climate change on the melting of the ice cap is very, very significant. And the melting of the ice is not what you can control. And I have seen the conglomeration of the walruses and the other Arctic mammals, which are good resources. So I want to find out, since they are under threat, whether there are any measures about domestication of these important resources, since we know we cannot control what is happening in the sea, you cannot stop the melting of the ice. And then there are changes in the waters, the plankton community, the baby community, in which some of these organisms have a link in the food web. So, to preserve the biodiversity and then sustainability of the marine mammals, are there a kind of steps towards domestication that are under our own control to shield them from the vagaries of climate change? Are there methods or ways of perhaps studying the physiology which we can simulate in the lab to make sure that they are conserved? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about conservation.
That's right. And that's a very interesting question. And I can tell you that for some of the species, I think that might be possible. The Alaska Sea Life Center is in Seward, Alaska. It's not in the Arctic. It's in south of the Aleutian Islands. But reality, it's all cold water. It's not ice, but yet, whatever. They deal with with rehabilitating sea lions and seals that are injured. They do some of that work. I would think that they can manage some of the seals. I don't know how anybody would manage walrus. I don't know how they would do that. I mean, obviously, polar bears are in zoos, and a lot of animals are in zoos. Polar bears can be kept. And some of the birds, I believe, can be kept, but some of them are extremely migratory. Like they travel hemispheres, through over tremendous. I just like blown away. Some of the animals are going down to the southern hemisphere for the wintering, and that's amazing. So I don't know how they would do that. I think some of them have been captured and are kept in for conservation, but I think there's just a lot of animals that may not be able to be kept. But on the other hand, these animals have also survived multiple glacial periods, my understanding. And so there may be, my hope is that there will actually be some hidden resiliencies within the animals to adapt to the change. And walrus in particular. I think the others can be managed except for walrus. I don't know how somebody can really manage those. So.
Question. Regarding the walruses again, you had mentioned that I think previously they were in smaller pods or herds, and then once things started warming up and started losing more ice, they gathered in much larger groups, and this created a problem for their survival of the young, and then also for seeking food. Can you explicate on that a little bit? I got lost. Why is it that the small groups then join larger groups? What's driving that?
So walrus are a social species, and they like to be with their friends, and that's how they live their life during the year is in groups. But what they prefer to do is be on ice floes, little patches of ice, and a patch of ice will support, depending on the ice where they're at, it can support maybe 10, 15, 20 animals. Some of the larger ice floes might support 100. We were on a ship one time, and we came up into the Bering Straits, and it was fantastic. All of a sudden, you see this floe of ice here that has maybe 15 walrus on it. That one over there has 30 walrus on it. This one over here had a really big bull, and he was going to fight the ship for who was in charge of that piece of ice. And all of a sudden, you look out, and the fog is low, but everywhere you can see just these ice floes. There's like 10,000 walrus just on all of these different ice floes, but they're all on ice floes, so that on one individual pocket, there's only like 20 or 30 species. 20 or 30 individuals. So they're all spread out accordingly. So when that ice goes away, they then go to shore, and they all do the same thing. Whereas before they're spread out more on ice floes. When they come to shore, they'll aggregate like that picture we saw, and there will be like 5,000 of them or more aggregated like that. And that's when something will spook them. All the walrus will go, uh-oh, and they'll head like a plane flying over. That was what did it one year. One of the Fish and Wildlife planes came over, not realizing what they were about to do, and they caused a scare. And then it was the young that got trampled as the walrus headed for the water. So that's how that happens. So it's an unfortunate byproduct. Right.
Are you planning to do those similar work to see these spatial patterns or spatial variables?
Right. So I have a talk here just after this, and then I'll be talking in a glacial fjord about some of the changes over time, and there's a little bit of an interaction with space there as well. But tomorrow's talk will be about the influence of topography and oceanographic currents on spatial drivers, and the short story of it is that prior to our work, starting in 2008, people assumed that the Chukchi Sea was oceanographically smooth and it was just like a tabletop. Well, when you think about oceanography and you think about, the Mariana Trench being in the region, then we have, hundreds of meters of change in the Bering Sea, from 100 meters to 500. Yeah, it seems flat, but it's the topographic deviations, the pimples on the landscape, that are actually causing changes in the current flow, either where current speeds up or where it slows down. That changes how much carbon is available to the animals present. And so the benthic animals respond, and where they respond to those changes in carbons, that's where we get what we call these benthic productivity hotspots, and that's where the marine mammals are focused on their feeding. So.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious when they're, I can see when they're all in small little populations. I would imagine disease is probably relatively low, but when they pack in those tight groups with 10,000 animals, would they ever study the effect of their immune systems? Or how to look, whether disease goes rampant?
I believe that those occurrences are so new that I'm not sure that we have any patterns, and they're inconsistent. So that 1 year that they hauled out like that, the next year there was enough ice for them to persist for a while longer, and so it's kind of a new problem, and I can't honestly say that anybody has looked at that yet, but I believe that some people are beginning to look at, I know one investigator was looking at potential for trichinosis. And so those are questions that are coming up, but I don't think that they have the temporal scale to address that yet. So sporadic. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you very much.